Hi, we're having a conversation with Edward Stringham. He is the editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise. Professor Stringham, even within this crisis, there is little doubt that the market is the best environment to provide goods and efficiency. So what about law enforcement in this context of market?
My opinion is that markets are so successful at providing all sorts of goods that we look at. Governments, in contrast, are unsuccessful at providing all types of goods. And I would argue that we should extend this logic and apply it to law enforcement too. So things that most people traditionally assume must be provided by government, such as courts and police, increasingly today are even being provided privately through things like arbitration or mediation or private security in shopping malls and colleges. All around the world, we can look out and see lots of examples of privately provided law enforcement.
But many people fear that, what about who protects me if I don't pay for the private police, for example?
It's a great question, and in many cases, it sounds difficult for people to charge for security, but in most cases, it's bundled with other goods. So when you go to the shopping mall, they provide a place to shop, but they also want it to be extremely safe. So bundled with the provision of the shopping mall are other associated public goods, such as security. When you go to a private college, bundled with the service of education is the service of security. So what private institutions can do is bundle what otherwise would be considered public goods, bundle that with the provision of a private good.
And well, this sounds well in a closed environment, such as a mall or as a college, but what about the streets? What about the roads? What about the city?
Implicit in most people's assumption about why markets cannot supply certain goods and services, such as police or security, is assuming that government needs to own all of the property in a society. Well, once government owns the roads, owns the streets, it becomes a commons, and there's much less incentive for those to be policed privately. As we see those things privately owned, such as in Disneyland or corporate office parks, the landowner benefits by providing those things, and it will actually increase the rent of the streets and the neighborhoods, the apartments, if they can have private security. That said, even in a world with government-owned streets, we can see increases, large increases in the amount of private policing. In San Francisco, for example, the San Francisco Special Patrol Police are privately funded police officers who are hired by the merchants, because merchants realize that they want to have a store that is in good order. They want to have a safe store. The merchants in a neighborhood want to have a safe neighborhood, otherwise people aren't going to shop there.
And what about competition? Wouldn't it be kind of weird having police from this side of town competing with the police of this other side of town or something like that?
Competition works well everywhere it's been practiced. Monopoly seems to work poorly everywhere it's practiced. And I would argue that competition is inherently a good thing. So the fact that a merchant has the ability to contract with a certain private security agency means that the private security agencies have to compete for those services. They have to compete to say to the merchant, we are worth it. We are going to provide good services to you. If the police don't have to compete and they just get paid out of tax dollars, there's really no incentive for them to want to reduce crime, to make things safe, to make customers happy. If it's provided bureaucratically, the police often have their own agenda, such as increasing revenue through tickets, or just spending their time arresting people who are easy targets rather than actually trying to reduce crime.
Finally, if police is private, What prevents criminals to hire their own law enforcement?
We can think of all of these hypothetical situations, but if you look at what happens in the world today, it's merchants who are hiring law enforcement. It's apartment buildings who are hiring law enforcement. It's colleges. And if these services are bundled with other goods that consumers want, it's the consumer ultimately who's paying for the law enforcement. It's the consumer of the shopping mall is the one who's hiring the shopping mall. So if there were a criminal shopping mall, it would not attract any customers. If, on the other hand, the shopping mall says, we want to attract customers and we're going to make this as pleasant and as safe a place as possible, then markets will work.
Now I'm tempted for another final question, and this is security for a mall is not law enforcement properly. How does that work?
It's one aspect of law enforcement, and one of the benefits of economics is looking at things marginally. Most people assume that all law is necessarily a public good that is provided either by government or not at all. And what my research has shown and my books have shown is that it can be provided in all different sorts of fashion. So we already have alarms. That's an aspect of security, which is clearly provided privately. When it's talking about patrol, right now there is some government, but increasingly private provision of security guards is common. Adjudication of disputes, that's a whole other area of law enforcement that often is assumed to must be a monopoly of the state. But we look at that increasingly arbitration, mediation has been
experience on that in civil law or commercial law, isn't it?
Exactly. So well over 90% of Fortune 500 firms use arbitration, and most people in their contracts, they will sign an arbitration clause that says, in the event of a dispute, we will choose to have this dispute settled privately in this private tribunal where the judges, the arbitrators, are private experts in the matter at hand, rather than having it go to government courts where it's really the luck of the draw.
Sure. And finally, you mentioned books, and the viewers may want to know which books are these.
I've edited 2 books on the subject. One is called Anarchy, State, and Public Choice, and the other book is called Anarchy and the Law, the Political Economy of Choice.
Well, thank you very much for sharing these ideas with us, and thank you too